Our next speaker is Greg Jarrell, and he's going to be speaking to us on urban renewal and the complicity of the church. Urban renewal and the complicity of the church. I am so excited about this session because I'm at one of them churches that love to plant campuses. And I'm excited about this session and his book coming out. And that's okay. Nobody's in here that can fire me, so I can say that, okay? All right, so Greg Jarrell is co-founder and cultural organizer with QC Family Tree. Greg is the author of A Riff of Love, Notes on Community and Belonging from Cascade Books. His writing has appeared in many publications, including The Bitter Southerner, Sojourners, Baptist News Global, and Axios Charlotte. He is also an in-demand saxophonist and performs regularly around North and South Carolina with a variety of bands. Will you all please join me in welcoming Greg Jarrell to the platform?
All right, hey everybody, thanks for the welcome. So I've got about 6 hours worth of material from this research I've been doing. I got to condense it down to 30 minutes. I want to give you one just quick kind of prefatory comment. Here's what's going to happen. I've got this story. I've given it for now the title, Trespasses of the Holy. I've been thinking a lot about white churches and the way that neighborhoods are made, the way that neighborhoods are taken, the role of the theo-political regime that we live under in the formation and the destruction of neighborhoods. And so I'm going to offer you a very specific story about the entanglement of one family and one institution here in Charlotte. I want to tell you that this entanglement is significant and it matters for that family and for that institution. But this story is not just about them. It maps very well that language I learned a couple of weeks ago from Shaniqua Walker-Barnes, whom I'm excited to hear later. It maps very well into the story of our country as a whole, which is why I think it's so important. All right, and so having said that, away we go. So I want to tell you a story about Abram North. This picture that you see is taken in front of the former building of Clinton Chapel AME Zion Church, the oldest black institution in Mecklenburg County that was founded free of white control. Founded about 3 or 4 weeks after the end of the Civil War, born from a hush arbor, which were the illicit gatherings of the faithful outside of the white gaze that enslaved people had. And so in this picture somewhere is a man named Abram North. I'm sure he's there. I don't know who he is. I haven't been able to get quite that far yet. But I want to tell you briefly about him. He's a really interesting character. He was born in around 1850, born enslaved on a plantation in Collette County, South Carolina. That is down towards Charleston. The town of Walterboro is in Collette County, South Carolina. So he grew up there, and the Civil War ended in 1865, and about 2 years later, he left, probably rode the train. The train is what made Charlotte, and the train ended right about where 7th Street and Brevard Street come together, where 7th Street Market is. That's where the train ended, the first train that was built into Charlotte. And so Abram North likely rode it here when he was about somewhere between 15 and 17 years old. He became, as you'll hear a little bit later, a key figure in Clinton Chapel AME Zion Church. When he arrived, black people were moving from all across, particularly sort of the plain country of South Carolina, to urban areas. Strength in numbers, protection from racial violence, from racial terror that's happening. And so they're coming for both for that kind of strength in numbers and for economic opportunity. But the system of enslavement reinvented itself very quickly into different forms, one by convict leasing, another by a form of domestic servitude. And so rather than being enslaved and living in a white person's house, you had an employer who was a white person whose house you lived in. And this is the house that Abram North lived in. It was the home of Samuel P. Smith. Samuel was born in 1834. His father was a plantation owner. He was the oldest son of Benjamin Rush Smith, whose plantation was around Woodlawn Road and South Tryon Street today. By 1860, the Smith family owned more than 20 enslaved people, which was, according to census records, the technical definition of the word plantation. And so, pardon me there. So Abram moved into that house. If you can move the slides back one, which is pictured here in 1968, so well after its heyday. But Samuel Smith actually owned most of the block at 7th and Brevard. It was then called 7th and B. On the corner was the building of First Baptist Church. And surrounding First Baptist Church was Samuel Smith's compound. 17 people lived in that compound, including our brother Abram North, who served there as domestic servant. He wrote to the paper on a regular basis, which is one of the ways that he shows up in the record, and recounts walking to not the First Baptist Church at 7th and B, which was then called something else, but to First Baptist Church, which is now First Baptist West, the black First Baptist Church on Oaklawn Avenue. Recalls walking there for education, to go to school, which was a common way that black churches were functioning in the community then and continue to function today. So Sam Smith moved here, away from the plantation, because he wanted to go to law school. He made a boatload of money as a lawyer. He became a shoe merchant, and in the continual reinvention of the plantation economy, he eventually became a cotton merchant. He and his brother Benjamin Rush Smith, Jr., were cotton merchants listed on the New York Stock Exchange, extremely wealthy, and so that same economy continued to fuel their work. Brother Smith was a member of First Baptist Church, the white one, and he lived right next door to it. And so he was probably one of the most prominent members of that congregation. And you can imagine there's a place in the record where Abram North is quoting back a hymn that's a white church hymn. It's a hymn of Charles Wesley, "Oh, 4,000 tongues to sing." And he's quoting it back years later. So it at least sorts of lends the historical imagination that not only was this guy who just moved to Charlotte living right there, but maybe even heard the music, attended before First Baptist West broke away. So anyway, this story maps on really well to how our city and how the South and how this country developed over the next little bit. So the period from 1867 to 1876 is known as the period of Reconstruction. This is an understudied, lesser known period that's probably the most hopeful period in this country. And what happened during that period was that the federal government used troops from up north who came down south and said, this system that you're trying to reinvent is not right, and we're going to enforce these new laws that we have that will begin to build some equity into the economic and political system. And so you saw black people elected to political office. You saw black people becoming homeowners and landowners. You saw the beginnings of equity. Now, I'm not saying it was idyllic in any way, but you saw the beginnings of that movement. And you can see that in Abram's life. He was a baseball player on the first professional baseball team in Charlotte called the Charlotte Recruits. He got married to a woman named Annice, who later became known as Annie, and they started a family. They moved to Third Ward around the time of post-Reconstruction. And in 1876, there's a contested presidential election. And it was like a real contested presidential election, not a made-up contested presidential election. And there was a compromise. The compromise was, at this point, so things have shifted now. Then the Republicans were the more broadly inclusive party. The Democrats were the party of white supremacy. Things have flipped. There's a history to that for a different time. But the compromise was the Democrats said, we will stand down and allow Rutherford B. Hayes to become the president, the Republican. In exchange, you have to withdraw the troops from the South that are enforcing the Reconstruction laws. The Republicans took the compromise because their loyalty was to their own power, not to the good of black people across the South. And segregation, the violent racial terror that has haunted this land until today began in earnest very quickly. It took a while for Jim Crow to come around, but it started back. And so one of the first things that happened is Zebulon B. Vance, who was one of the fiercest warriors in the Civil War, who was not allowed to take office, was reelected as governor almost immediately following Reconstruction, and became United States Senator after that. But along the way, of course, black communities, including Brother North, were working as hard as they could to influence, to build their own families, to build their own communities. And Abram had some success. He had jobs not just as domestic servant, but he became an insurance agent. He became a grocer at one point. He was a post office janitor, which was a prominent job because it was a political patronage job. You couldn't, not just anybody could show up at the post office and apply. You had to be appointed by the party apparatus. So this guy was active in the Republican Party during a key moment in North Carolina history called the Fusion Movement. So just before Jim Crow happened in 1898, before Jim Crow laws began to be written, following the election of 1898, there was this really interesting period. Dr. Barber of the Poor People's Campaign talks about this a lot, where poor white people and poor black people began voting together. They said, our common economic interest is far more important than the racial lies that we've been fed. They might not have quite gotten that far, but they at least knew that their money belonged together. And if we vote these folks out together, we can get a lot of good done. Abram North was one of the important operatives within that whole apparatus. And that's how he gets the political patronage job. But in 1898, there's a hostile takeover. There's a coup in Wilmington where dozens of black residents are killed in the streets. A duly elected, legally elected town government is deseated, and white supremacy begins to reign. In 1900, there's a parade down Tryon Street. They called it the White Supremacy Parade. And they said, the banners said, no more Negro rule. So there was one alderman from Charlotte, one black alderman, that elicited that sort of fear, that sort of reaction within the white community about, folks tried to re-grab the power, and they did it. They did it violently. And violent segregation was then enforced. At that point, our city became very segregated. Before that, folks lived on the same blocks. Living in proximity does not guarantee any social good at all. But it does have the opportunity to inspire your imagination in a way that complete and total violent segregation does not. Right? So it doesn't guarantee anything, but it does open up some possibilities. But following 1898, the city becomes violently segregated, and black people are forced to move primarily to Second Ward. When they lived in First Ward and Third Ward, they lived on individual blocks without any other white residents. All white blocks are all black blocks, but no mixing. And so the economic strategy that developed around this was what we would call a siege. A siege is simply where you surround a town. So you can imagine Second Ward, which by then was called Brooklyn, surrounded. So when you lay siege to a city in war, the idea is to cut off the supply lines. So you don't have to kill anybody, you just starve them all to death slowly. And this was the strategy of Jim Crow. Okay, so you can hit the next slide, if you will. So the challenge was then for people to build institutions in the midst of their communities being under siege. Now, because of the brilliance because of the resolute grit that black communities had. In Charlotte, here, black communities built remarkable institutions. The Mecklenburg Investment Company. On the left, you see Clinton Chapel AME Zion Church. This was their building that what sits there now is Romare Bearden Park. That's where that building was. So a gorgeous building, right? That's in 3rd Ward. Over in 2nd Ward, you had funeral homes, you had schools, you had restaurants, you had doctors, you had lawyers, you had the investment company that was helping to nurture businesses that were coming along. You had homeowners, including the North family at 625 East 2nd Street. But the thing about being under siege is that you can work as hard as you possibly can, but your stealing still stays really low, right? If you're cut off from the supply of money that everybody else has, you can do some remarkable stuff, but you're capped at a certain level. The building on the right is that plantation money at First Baptist Church that the Smith family gave. When they went and found this lot at 7th and Tryon, which is now called Spirit Square, by the way, the building still stands. So Samuel Smith from the plantation went and helped to buy this lot. And they built this building there, and it suited them well. It's a gorgeous building. You should go into it sometime. You should go to a show at Spirit Square. It's just a gorgeous building. It doesn't look like a Baptist church at all. There's no, I don't mean anything by that. It just doesn't look like a Baptist church. It's Byzantine in its construction, right? That's the architectural movement. So those institutions were being built at the same time with an almost limitless supply of money, and as you heard Justin say just a few minutes ago, money that had roots. And the roots went back to plantations and to families like the Smith family. Okay, so I'm going to give you like 30 seconds in a broad sweep. That strategy of the siege continued in different forms. One of those forms was called redlining. That's relatively more commonly known. While the country was in the Great Depression, the housing market was a wreck. 50% of mortgages were underwater. Meaning they were ready to foreclose within a couple of years. If you have a bad economy and then the housing market collapses, then you have a huge disaster. And so the federal government decided to prop up the housing economy, to fix those bad mortgages. But they fixed them when they assessed the risk of what are the mortgages we should save and what are the ones we shouldn't. Race was a primary factor in determining that. They drew maps. A member of Myers Park Baptist, there are lots of churches implicated in this history. A member of Myers Park Baptist helped to draw the maps. A real estate investor named Lee Kinney helped to draw the maps. He redlined his own properties because it was advantageous to do so. It was if you were a landowner, you could starve an area, right? Make it depressed, and then you could charge high rents. Because of racial segregation, people didn't have anywhere else to go. They had to pay whatever you said. So Lee Kinney redlined his own properties. Yep. So the siege continued. The siege continued. And so you can hit the next slide, if you will. And so then in 1960, or really in 1957, the city of Charlotte said, there's some money that's out there available for us. And the money is through this federal program called Urban Renewal. And we can use that money. The federal government will reimburse us 75% of anything we spend to raise, R-A-Z-E, the slums, S-L-U-M-S, to raise the slums within our city. Now, language is power, and so naming a neighborhood a slum was already an act of power. It was an act of power that they had to go to the state. The state had previously told them, no, you can't do that. So that the city spent years, along with several other North Carolina cities, petitioning the state, advocating for, lobbying for the ability to call certain neighborhoods slums based on their physical characteristics. Yep. And so by 1960, the city had developed plans. They had established a redevelopment commission that was made up of 5 white men. They had surveyed, and they had centered in on Brooklyn, and or Second Ward, and they came up with this grand plan that we're going to raise 238 acres of neighborhood. So you could take out, based on the state law, you could take out 100% of the buildings if you could prove that 2/3 of them were in derelict shape. So it didn't have to be 100%. It only had to be 2/3 of them, but you could take everything if you could prove that 2/3 were in derelict shape. And so the city did this. Now, when they did, they got a lot of resistance from the NAACP and from churches, black churches, and other groups. They also got resistance from white landowners, including men like Lee Kinney, including another guy named Martin Waters, who showed up at city council and he said, "This is not right. You cannot take this land. And here are the 3 reasons you can't take this land. For one, it's against our inviolable property rights for the federal government to take our land. For 2, you're not getting as good a deal as you think you are. You're not going to wind up with as much money as you think you will through this program. We're going to get screwed in the end. And for 3, there are a lot of elderly white ladies who live across town whose primary income is derived from renting substandard housing in Second Ward and neighborhoods like it. In other words, slumlording is profitable." And so there was some resistance, but the city was not daunted by the resistance. They said, "We're going through with this," and so they elected to do so. At the same time, First Baptist Church was considering a move. Like many white churches, they were saying, "Our people are moving away from downtown. We should probably go with them." And so they found a beautiful 16-acre lot in South Park at the corner of Runnymede and Sharon. And they were ready to put a bid down on it, but their deacon board turned them down. They said, "No, we're not going to join the movement out in that direction. We're going to stay put." And there are some fascinating stories that there's just not time for today, but this becomes a really significant point, because what happens next is that the Urban Renewal Commission, or the Redevelopment Commission as it was called, you can hit the next slide, shows up to begin buying houses from homeowners within the Brooklyn area. So Lee Kinney owned a bunch of homes. White people owned most of the property. There were about 40 landowners that owned the largest portion of the property. 90% of the homes were owned by people on the outside of the neighborhood by 1960. Only about 10% were owner-occupied residences. Again, this is not because people didn't want to own their homes. It's because they were under siege. It was difficult and in many cases impossible for them to. So the first sale by a white landowner was to Lee Kinney, who sold a 2-story building on a standard size lot for $18,000. The first black homeowner who received a knock on her door was Miss Hazeline North Anderson, the daughter of Abram North. She was paid $6,000 for her 1-story home at 625 East 2nd Street. So Lee Kinney had twice the house. He got 3 times the money. And this is what was built into the entirety of those transactions. You can see Sam here. Pictures are hard to find, especially good ones. I've got a bad picture of Hazeline, but it's not clear enough to see. So there's Sam in front of the house that they moved to at 2028 Oak Lawn Avenue. That's going to come back in just a second. Next slide. So in 1961, the demolition starts. It starts at 310 South Davidson Street. Not long after that, it happens at 625 East 2nd Street. You can see this current Google map where the red, that Google Maps sign says you are here. That's 310 South Davidson. And you can see the yellow dot that I drew in, which sits right on what you might even think of as the cornerstone of First Baptist. That was the first portion to be built. That's the home of Abram North and later of his daughter Hazeline North Anderson. So those first destructions happen where now First Baptist Church, the white one, sits. Next slide. So, in 1963, one more time, First Baptist Church voted not to move to the suburbs. They said, we want to stay downtown. They said, we want to stay downtown. The ringleader of this was a guy named Bill Poe, who's real important in Charlotte history around the desegregation and resistance to the desegregation of our schools. So they gave several reasons that we should stay. Baptist people need to be near the halls of power. Baptist people need to have a voice. This is not uncommon, right? Baptist churches set up near, we want to be able to speak truth to power, right? It's not in proximity in that way, it's good. Yep, so Baptist people need to have a voice downtown. We need a Baptist presence downtown. We need to be able to minister to the drunks and the people without the right clothes was the language that Bill Poe used. Not my language, that's the language that was in the newspaper report from that day. Yep. So here's what they failed to notice. There were 12 black churches in the Brooklyn area. There were 3 black Baptist churches in the Brooklyn area. There were already Baptists there. Friendship Baptist was there. Ebenezer Baptist was there. St. Paul Baptist was there. Friendship is today probably the most influential church within this city. Certainly the most influential black church, maybe the most influential church, period, within this city. They were in Brooklyn at the where the NASCAR Hall of Fame sits now, which is quite an image. And so the city decided, so the city moved these folks out, and First Baptist said, we want to stay downtown. We got to have a Baptist voice downtown, even though the Baptist voice was being pushed elsewhere. The Dr. King Baptists were already there. They were being forced out, right? And so the city puts the land up for auction, and one of the ways that they enforced a whites-only policy was that Hazeline North Anderson's lot was small. And if you're trying to buy land is expensive, and you don't have a lot of money, you can only afford to buy a small piece of land. So what the city did is they bundled lots together. So instead of buying one lot, now you bought 50 lots that just became one lot. And so by doing that, they effectively put up a whites-only sign around the land, right? Only white folks can buy it. And so they put up 2 big lots for auction, and they got, after all the grand plans, after all the work they had done, the images they had drawn, these big tall towers, hotels, conventions, the streets filled with people, they put up these 2 big auction lots for sale, and they got 2 bids. One from a Ford dealership and one from a Dodge dealership. Massive parking lots, the most suburban use possible. Urban renewal was going to turn the city into a giant parking lot. So they put up another lot for sale after they had to sell to those 2 car dealerships, and nobody really wanted it. But this article, you can see the headline, Brooklyn Tract Shoved in First Baptist Direction. Within the article, it characterizes it as the city rolling out a red carpet for First Baptist to come and bid on these 9 acres in downtown. And they even changed the rules of the auction to make it a little easier for First Baptist to win the auction. It doesn't seem like anybody else bid on it, so it probably made no difference. But all the same, you can see we have a theopolitical regime here. We're planting quite the symbol right in the heart of our city. Right next to City Hall, we've replaced 12 churches with 1 white church. Next slide. So this has material consequences. And I'm going to have to talk really fast. But here's the material consequences. If you run all the numbers through an inflation calculator, this is what you get. In 1965, they paid $465,000. In 2021 dollars, that's $3.8 million for 9 acres downtown. Now, that land is worth, according to the county's valuation, which is not the market value, according to the county's valuation, about $34 million. That is an appreciation of 900%. So this is why we buy real estate, right? because it appreciates. So, pretty good deal, right? The market price, rough guess, is probably twice that. So that's a nice investment. That's a nice return on your investment, yeah? When the Redevelopment Commission came and told you that you were going to sell your house, whether you wanted to or not, like they did to Hazeline Anderson, they said, you're going to sell your house, and here's how much money we're going to give you. And if you didn't take that money, you were at risk of getting nothing, and so you just took the money. They also gave you a resettlement assistance by one of their staff members, and the Andersons moved to 2028 Oak Lawn Avenue to a house that they paid. So they got paid $6,300 for their house. They paid $6,500 for a new house, about the same size, on a lot that was slightly bigger. If you really wanted a big garden, you might even argue they got a slight upgrade for all their trouble. Yeah? But years and years of intervening investment and disinvestment have made a difference. So next slide. You can see they paid $59,000 in 1961 for this house. The county's valuation of that now is $56,700. That means over the course of 60 years, they have lost about 4% of that value. But we've been told that the dream is to buy a house, right? We've been told that the dream is to buy a house and to pass it on to your heirs, and that this is how we build generational wealth. And you can see that that's just not true. That there are other conditions. The conditions are racial. They're not only racial, but they are especially racial. And so that leaves those of us like me who are white Christians with some particular work to do. And I want to try to address that briefly in the next slide and to give you a couple of minutes to talk back to me. So my question for the project that I'm undertaking is how this happened. This text didn't come out clear. I did my best. But there's some, what it says is the guy on the left is Ray King, and he was a member of the First Presbyterian Church. And the guy next to him is W.J. Smith of First Baptist Church. And the guy next to him is Ray Fennell of St. Gabriel's Catholic Church. And the guy next to him is Ted Rickenbacker, or Thomas Rickenbacker of Christ Episcopal Church. So how all this happened is that Christians did it. They went to church on Sunday. Mayor Brookshire, who was the mayor at this time, was a member of Myers Park United Methodist. Ray King was that famous picture that you've seen of the bulldozer plowing into the house in Urban Renewal. If you've seen the museum pictures of it, that's Ray King sitting on that. So either they taught them to do that in church, or they just pretended nothing was happening and helped then to reinforce what the business community was teaching Monday through Friday, what the political community was teaching Monday through Friday. So Christians did this. And we have theology, we have songs, we have sermons, we have readings of Scripture that help to reinforce these kinds of results, that in some ways almost make these sorts of results inevitable until we confront what's within our tradition. So next slide. So what we have to do, in my estimation, are two things. For one, there have to be material reparations. There's simply no other way around that. We can, I've already shown you, in one case, we can partially calculate the damages. We should not think that anybody could ever, there is no check, there are not enough zeros in the world. There's not a check big enough to capture all the zeros. But the damages can be partially calculated. And the equity in real estate that our churches sit upon is part of the sacrifice that we have to make, because it's not really ours anyway. It has all been bought by plunder. Institutions are responsible. So what I don't want you to think I'm doing is coming for First Baptist Church alone, because members of Myers Park Baptist, probably the most progressive white church in the city, were just as responsible at turning the gears on this whole thing as anybody at First Baptist was. First Baptist is a splendid symbol, but they're not alone in this. And I think we have to consider that buildings can always be torn down. We can tear the highway up of 277, right? Title has always been revocable to land. Title to land has always been revocable. We've just only chose to revoke it when black people or when Native people live on it. We've never chosen to revoke it when white people occupy it. And we can change that. And we can lead the way as white Christians through our repentance. And part of our material work has to be continuing to dig up these stories. This history is available. You just have to want to know it. And I will tell you from my work at First Baptist Church, they've been courageous, I think, in letting me in at all. We are strange bedfellows, us. But they don't know. And they don't know because they chose not to know. They started choosing not to know in the 1960s when they refused to call the Brooklyn neighborhood by its name. They simply called it urban redevelopment land. Conquest happens by renaming. That's not the only way, of course, but that's one of the steps. Conquest happens by renaming. So in Greertown, when Crossroads Corporation, who has righted the ship and is doing much better, they built this thing called Elizabeth Heights. They renamed a section of Greertown. Well, that tells you everything you need to know if you're a longtime resident of Greertown. Who's this for and who's this not for, right? Renaming matters a lot. But the material is not sufficient, because if we continue to have relationships that are based on exploitation, then we can write all the checks in the world, and we're not going to fundamentally shift the balance of power, nor the ways that we've learned to interact, nor are we going to change the damage that this has done to our souls as white Christians, as white people. And so we have to start pulling out the threads of our theologies that have made this happen, that have made it nearly inevitable, and that have kept it continuing to happen, present space included. It continues to happen. The details are different now, but the story is the same. And all of this includes everything. So at First Baptist Church in 1965, when they're voting to take over this land, they're singing a conquest hymn. Lead on, O King Eternal, the day of March has come. It's in the bulletin. The following week, when they made the vote, the week before they had the preparation meeting, they sang the conquest hymn. The next week, when they made the vote, they read and preached from Numbers 13, which is the story of the Israelites taking a conquest journey into Canaan. And they said, that is a land that is flowing with milk and honey. And they had sent these spies there, right? And Caleb, the strong one of the spies, said, we are well able to take this land. But the other spies got scared. They said, we are but grasshoppers and they are giants. Yeah? So if we've read ourselves into the biblical stories that way, then we got some unlearning. We got more unlearning to do than we can accomplish in one lifetime. But the time to start is now. And speaking of Numbers 13, if you read womanist or post-colonial interpretations of that text, there's some more layers in there too. Like, we can keep going deeper. We've got so much work to do in this respect. And so making those material reparations and dismantling our white theologies, asking the questions, pulling those strands out is what we have to do. So I'll leave you with a word from Ta-Nehisi Coates in reflecting on his landmark story, that the case for reparations. He said, what is needed is an airing of family secrets, a settling with old ghosts. We live in haunted territory, and you keep a ghost alive by ignoring it. Only until we address these things head on will we find a settling with those old ghosts. Thanks.
All right, I couldn't type the quote on the old ghost, so I'll get that later from you. Okay, thank you. All right, Greg, thank you so much. We have a question in Slido. If you have any questions for Greg, make sure to send them to Slido. And we have a question that says, how do I, as an individual, push for or help make reparations? What's my steps?
So we need the leadership of Black and Indigenous communities on this. So I'm not sure that I'm the one that should tell you, except to tell you that there are sufficient resources out there. Sandy Darity, or first name formerly is William Darity, has a tremendous volume about the necessity for and the actual practice of reparations, how they can be implemented. There has been a bill called H.R. 40 stalled in the House of Representatives for about 40 years to establish simply a study commission on reparations. You can go and advocate for that. So as far as bringing other people along, I think that the stories tell themselves. So part of learning the history, I think, is doing. If you go and dig into the history, you'll find, oh yeah, this is morally necessary. This is economically and politically necessary. We can make it happen. And so if you want to invite other people on that journey, the stories aren't hard to dig up, and I can sort of point you in some directions. There are plenty of historians around that can help you to find some of that information.
That's good. Sorry, I was taking notes. All right. Greg, this seems such like a daunting task. This is my question. It seems like such a daunting task for this wrong, specifically in regards to the stealing of land and displacement of people. It seems like such a daunting task. Is it doable in your view? Is it doable for people like those of us in this room to make a difference in this area of injustice in our city?
We can make steps. It has taken us, the doctrine of discovery, sort of the theological underpinnings of all this happened in 1465. So it's taken us almost 600 years to get to this point. So the sort of inheritance that we can leave for our children is to say, no, we're not going to do that anymore, and to begin moving in a different direction. That is the biblical image of repentance, by the way. To repent in Hebrew, the word is shuv, which simply means to turn around, to start walking in the other direction. Can we get it done? I don't know. But can our children and our grandchildren get it done? Well, that's the sort of legacy that we can leave for them.
That's good. Last question. What are some resources you recommend to learn more about the true history of Charlotte?
There are a handful of books out there that don't get a lot of publication. One of them is called Bittersweet Legacy. The author's name is Jeanette Greenwood. She's a terrific historian. And it has helped me to sort of see underneath some of the history that has not been well advertised. Tom Hanchett's book is always good. And I will highly recommend that you spend some time with Will Griffin, who currently is the historian at the Levine Museum of the New South. He is writing a book about an important and unknown character named Tresvant Anderson. Will is a Black scholar, native of Charlotte, and he's got some important work for us coming. So that should be out fairly soon. I would encourage you to keep your eyes peeled for that.
That's good. That's good. Thank you so much, Greg. Can we all give Mr. Greg Jarrell a hand? Thank you so much.